On the 23rd of May, 1618, 3 men were thrown out of a third-floor window in Prague Castle. They fell 70 feet. They all survived. And that single event triggered a war so catastrophic it wiped out a third of the entire German population. You were never taught that part. Schools give you the name, the defenestration of Prague, and move on. They never tell you why 3 men survived a 70-foot drop. They never tell you the war that followed killed more Germans than World War I. They never explain that it reshaped Christianity, monarchy, and the map of Europe so completely that we are still living inside the consequences right now. Let us go back to the actual room. It is the spring of 1618. The Holy Roman Empire is fracturing. For nearly a century, Protestant and Catholic powers have been circling each other like wolves. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 had created a fragile truce. Each prince could choose the religion of his territory. But that truce was collapsing. Protestant nobles in Bohemia were furious. The Habsburg Emperor Matthias had been systematically dismantling their religious freedoms. They demanded answers. They got a meeting. On that May morning, 4 Protestant lords marched into the Bohemian chancellery at Prague Castle. They confronted 2 royal governors, Vilém Slavata and Jaroslav Martinic, plus their secretary, Philip Fabricius. The trial was improvised and instant. The verdict was unanimous. The punishment was the traditional Bohemian sentence for traitors. Out the window. All 3 men tumbled 70 feet into the dry moat below. And then something extraordinary happened. They stood up. They walked away. Every single one of them survived. The Catholics immediately called it a miracle from God. Fabricius claimed he had been carried down by angels. Protestant pamphlets had a different explanation. The 3 men had landed in a pile of horse manure. It was not a miracle. It was a very fortunate garbage heap. That detail matters more than it sounds. Because the spin war that erupted around those 3 falling bodies previewed exactly what the next 30 years would look like. 2 sides, 2 stories, no common ground, and an entire continent willing to bleed for the right version. If this kind of history surprises you, the real version, not the sanitized one, subscribe now. We cover the stories they cut out of the textbooks. Now here is the layer that changes everything. The defenestration was not spontaneous. It was a planned political act disguised as outrage. The Protestant nobles of Bohemia had been organizing for months. Throwing those men from the window was a declaration of war against Habsburg authority, and they knew it. Within days they formed a provisional government. Within weeks they were raising an army. Within 2 years they had offered the Bohemian crown to Frederick V, the Protestant elector of the Palatinate. Frederick accepted. It was the worst decision in his life. His reign lasted exactly 1 winter. History gave him a permanent nickname for it, the Winter King. In November 1620, at the Battle of White Mountain outside Prague, Habsburg forces shattered the Protestant army in under 2 hours. Frederick fled. Bohemia was crushed. The Counter-Reformation rolled in like a tide. 27 Protestant leaders were publicly executed in Prague's Old Town Square. Their heads were mounted on the Charles Bridge for 10 years. But the war did not end. It metastasized. What began as a Bohemian religious revolt became the feeding ground for every power struggle in Europe. Denmark entered to protect Protestants. Spain sent money and troops to support the Habsburgs. Sweden, under the brilliant and reckless Gustavus Adolphus, invaded Germany in 1630 and turned the conflict into something almost unrecognizable from its origins. France, a Catholic kingdom, funded Protestant armies because Cardinal Richelieu cared more about breaking Habsburg power than about theology. That is the war no one teaches. Not a holy war. A power war dressed in religious clothing. By the time the Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648, the numbers were almost incomprehensible. Estimates vary, but historians believe between 8 million and 12 million people died. The German territories lost roughly a third of their entire population. Some regions lost half. Villages that existed in 1618 simply did not exist in 1648. The land had swallowed them. And now for the piece that connects this to your world today. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 did not just end the war. It invented the modern nation-state. For the first time, European powers agreed that each sovereign state had the right to govern its own internal affairs without outside religious interference. The Pope could not override a king. An emperor could not dictate faith across borders. Sovereignty became the organizing principle of international relations. Every diplomatic framework you live inside, the United Nations, international law, the concept of national sovereignty itself, traces its philosophical DNA back to that treaty. Back to those negotiations. Back to that exhausted, devastated continent trying to agree on rules so that nothing like the 30 Years' War could happen again. And it all connects back to 3 men falling out of a window in Prague on a May morning in 1618. 3 men who landed in a dung heap and walked away. 3 men whose survival became a propaganda miracle. 3 men whose fall started a chain reaction that killed millions and rewrote the architecture of the entire modern world. The window is still there. You can visit it. You can stand in that room in Prague Castle and look down at the courtyard where it happened. It does not look like the birth of the modern world. It looks like a window. That is always how it starts. Not with trumpets. With one small act in a room that most people never heard of, in a city that most people never visit, that somehow moved everything that came after it. The 30 Years' War is the history they skipped because it is too complicated and too dark and too honest about what human beings do when they mix religion with power. But that is exactly why it matters. And that is exactly why you need to know it. If you want more history like this, the uncomfortable kind, the real kind, subscribe and hit the bell. The next story is even more buried than this one. You are not going to want to miss it.